"Mother, you'll need to move your things to the garden shed," my son announced as he and his wife stood in my kitchen. "We're converting your bedroom into a home gym. It's perfectly adequate. I've even installed a space heater." That night, as they slept, I signed the deed to my farmhouse over to Maria, the kind nurse who had helped me recover after my stroke. 3 months later, I watched from my new sunlit apartment as my son received the eviction notice for the property his great-grandfather had built with his bare hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The soil of western Montana had been under my fingernails for the better part of 7 decades. I was born Margaret Sullivan in 1950, in the very farmhouse my great-grandfather James had built in the Bitterroot Valley back in 1897. The house stood as a testament to family perseverance. 2 stories of weathered timber with a wraparound porch that offered views of the Sapphire Mountains to the east and the Bitterroot Range to the west. From my earliest memories, I was a child of the land, helping my father tend our modest apple orchard, learning from my mother how to preserve the summer's bounty for winter months, and falling asleep to the whisper of ponderosa pines outside my bedroom window. The changing seasons marked the rhythm of our lives: spring planting, summer harvesting, fall preserving, and winter planning. Even as a child, I understood that our connection to this place ran deeper than mere ownership. It was our heritage, our identity, the physical manifestation of our family's story. My father, William Sullivan, was a quiet man with hands as rough as tree bark and a heart as soft as freshly turned soil. He taught high school mathematics during the week and worked our land on weekends and summers, finding equal satisfaction in helping young minds grasp algebraic concepts and in coaxing apples from twisted old trees his grandfather had planted. "Math and farming aren't so different, Maggie," he'd tell me as we walked the orchard rows. "Both require patience, precision, and faith that your efforts will bear fruit, even when the results aren't immediately visible." My mother, Elizabeth, had been the county librarian before devoting herself to raising me and my younger brother, Robert. She filled our home with books and our garden with heirloom vegetables, believing that nourishing minds and bodies were equally important tasks. During long winter evenings, she would read to us by the fire, tales of pioneering families not unlike our own, who had carved lives from wilderness through determination and community. Education was non-negotiable in our household, but so was practical knowledge. I learned calculus and canning, literature and livestock care, chemistry and carpentry. When I left for Montana State University in 1968, I carried with me not just academic preparation, but a profound understanding of how theoretical knowledge and practical application intertwined. Teaching came as naturally to me as breathing. For 43 years, I taught science at Bitterroot Valley High School, guiding generations of students through the mysteries of biology and botany. My classroom was rarely confined by 4 walls. We'd analyze soil samples from the school grounds, classify native plants on nature walks, and track seasonal changes in the local ecosystem. "Mrs. Sullivan makes science real," was the common refrain in yearbook signatures and graduation cards. Former students would return years later, some with children of their own in tow, to tell me how our woodland ecology unit had inspired their forestry career, or how our discussions of agricultural chemistry had enhanced their family farming operations. I met my husband Gerald during my first year of teaching. He taught history in the classroom next to mine, and our shared passions for education and the natural world quickly blossomed into love. Tall and thoughtful with prematurely salt and pepper hair, Gerald approached history the way I approached science, as a living, breathing subject best understood through direct engagement rather than textbook recitation. He organized archaeological digs at local historical sites, brought in tribal elders to share oral histories overlooked in standard curricula, and connected Bitterroot Valley's development to broader patterns of Western expansion and settlement. His students left his classroom understanding that history wasn't just dates and names, but the complex interweaving of human choices, environmental conditions, and cultural contexts. We married in the summer of 1973, honeymooning in Glacier National Park before returning to my family's farmhouse, which my parents had gifted us as a wedding present. They had built a smaller, single-level home on the property's edge, better suited to their aging needs while allowing them to remain connected to the land they loved. "This land has Sullivan blood and sweat in every acre," my father said as he handed over the deed. "Keep it in the family, keep it loved." Gerald and I had one child, our son Thomas, born in 1975. From the beginning, Thomas seemed different from the rest of us, less enchanted by the natural world, more drawn to manufactured things. While I had spent my childhood climbing trees and collecting wildflowers, Thomas preferred assembling complicated Lego structures and later, programming the computer Gerald brought home in the mid-1980s. We tried to nurture his interests while still instilling appreciation for our family legacy. We converted one of the farmhouse's spare bedrooms into a makeshift computer lab, where Thomas spent hours writing simple programs and games. Gerald built him a workshop in the barn, where Thomas designed and constructed increasingly sophisticated mechanical projects. "He has an engineer's mind," Gerald would say proudly. "He sees systems and solutions where others see problems." Yet despite our efforts to bridge Thomas's technological interest with our agricultural lifestyle, the gap widened as he grew. During his teenage years, he became increasingly vocal about his desire to leave Montana for "somewhere that matters," as he put it, a phrase that stung despite our attempts to understand his perspective. "There's nothing for me here," he declared during his senior year of high school. "Just outdated traditions and a dying way of life." Gerald and I were heartbroken, but determined to support his journey, even if it diverged from the path we had envisioned. When Thomas was accepted to the University of Washington's computer science program in 1993, we helped him pack his belongings and drove him to Seattle, watching with bittersweet pride as he strode confidently into his dormitory without a backward glance. "He'll find his way back," Gerald reassured me on the long drive home. "Maybe not physically, but he'll eventually understand the value of what we've tried to give him." Thomas thrived in Seattle's tech-centered environment. He graduated with honors, secured a position at one of the emerging software companies, and quickly ascended their corporate ladder. He met and married Diane, a sleek, ambitious marketing executive whose designer clothes and manicured appearance seemed as foreign to our world as our mud-caked boots and sun-weathered skin must have seemed to hers. Their visits to the farmhouse grew increasingly infrequent and brief. Thomas would spend most of his time on conference calls or complaining about the spotty internet connection, while Diane made little effort to hide her discomfort with the composting toilet in the guest bathroom or the occasional field mouse that made its way into the mudroom. "You should really upgrade this place," became their standard refrain. Or better yet, sell it and buy something manageable in town. "Property values are skyrocketing with all the California transplants." Gerald and I would exchange glances but hold our tongues. This was their vacation, after all, and we didn't want the limited time with our sons spoiled by arguments about values and priorities. Widowhood came earlier than I'd expected. Gerald suffered a massive heart attack while splitting firewood in the winter of 2002, just shy of his 55th birthday. I was 52, suddenly alone in the family home where I'd expected to grow old with my husband. My parents had both passed years earlier, my father from cancer in 1995, my mother from pneumonia just 6 months after, as if unwilling to remain in a world without her partner of nearly 5 decades. Thomas flew in for the funeral, but left immediately after, citing an important product launch that couldn't proceed without him. "You should sell that old place, Mom," he suggested as I drove him to the airport. "It's too much maintenance for one person." But the farmhouse wasn't just a building to me. It was the physical embodiment of family history, of promises kept through generations. The wide front porch where my grandfather had taught me to identify constellations. the kitchen where my mother had pressed apple cider and where I'd later taught Thomas to bake his father's favorite gingerbread cookies. The study where Gerald and I had graded papers side by side for nearly 3 decades. "This house knows who I am," I replied to Thomas's suggestion, "and I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it." Which was true, at least for the next 15 years. I continued teaching until mandatory retirement at 65, then threw myself into community initiatives, establishing a seed library at the county extension office, volunteering at the Historical Society, and mentoring young teachers navigating their first classroom experiences. The farmhouse and its surrounding acres became my sanctuary. I expanded the vegetable garden, planted new apple varieties alongside the heirloom trees, and converted Gerald's workshop into a small laboratory where I conducted agricultural experiments, in collaboration with local organic farmers. My brother Robert and his wife lived just 30 miles away in Hamilton, and we established a Sunday dinner tradition that became the highlight of my week. Their 3 children, all now grown with families of their own, would often join us, filling the old farmhouse with the laughter and energy it had been designed to hold. "I worry about you out here alone," Robert would occasionally say. "You know, there's always room at our place if you ever change your mind." "I'm not alone," I would reply. "I have generations of Sullivans keeping me company." The stroke hit me at 68, without warning or preamble. I had been pruning the apple trees one April morning, the spring sunshine warm on my back as I carefully shaped branches for optimal light exposure. One moment I was reaching upward, pruning shears in hand. The next, the world suddenly tilted, sideways, colors bleeding into one another as I collapsed beneath the ancient tree my great-grandfather had planted. Fortunately, it was a Sunday. Robert and his wife Janet arrived for dinner to find me semi-conscious in the orchard, face pressed, against the damp spring soil that had sustained our family for generations. The rural ambulance service transported me 30 miles to St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, their sirens cutting through the peaceful Bitterroot afternoon. I awoke in the hospital to discover that the left side of my body wasn't responding properly. My speech was slurred, and the independent life I'd built was in jeopardy. The neurologist explained that I had suffered an ischemic stroke. A blood clot had blocked flow to part of my brain, causing damage that would require extensive rehabilitation to overcome. "You're fortunate it wasn't worse," he said, his voice kind but clinical. With proper therapy and dedication, many patients regain significant function, but recovery takes time and patience. Thomas arrived 2 days later, his corporate efficiency momentarily displaced by genuine concern. "I've arranged for the best specialists," he announced, laptop open beside my hospital bed as he coordinated video consultations and second opinions. "We'll get you the care you need to get back on your feet." Recovery was slow and humbling. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by 2 months in a rehabilitation facility. The woman who had once split her own firewood and maintained 20 acres now struggled to button her own cardigan or walk unassisted to the bathroom. My left arm remained stubbornly weak, my left leg unreliable, and my once precise speech occasionally tangled around certain consonants. It was in the rehabilitation facility that I met Maria Chavez, a night nurse whose gentle encouragement and unwavering patience helped me regain my dignity during the most vulnerable time of my life. Unlike some staff who treated elderly patients with clinical detachment or forced cheerfulness, Maria approached her work with authentic compassion and quiet respect. "You will get stronger, Mrs. Sullivan," she would assure me during the difficult therapy sessions when frustration brought tears to my eyes. "Focus on today's victory, not yesterday's abilities." Maria was in her early 40s, a single mother who had emigrated from Guatemala as a teenager. She lived in a small apartment with her teenage daughter, Isabella, who sometimes accompanied her mother during evening shifts, quietly doing homework in the corner of the nurses' station. Unlike many teenagers who seemed uncomfortable around the elderly, Isabella sought me out during her visits, curious about my life and experiences. Isabella has her heart set on becoming a botanist, Maria told me one night as she helped me practice my exercises. She's fascinated by your stories. About the apple orchard, over the weeks of my rehabilitation, Isabella would bring me botanical books from the library, asking questions about native Montana plants and agricultural techniques. I found myself looking forward to their visits, my educator's heart responding to her genuine interest just as it had to generations of students. "You remind me of myself at your age," I told her one evening. Curious about everything that grows, always wanting to understand the why behind the what. "My science teacher says I ask too many questions," Isabella admitted with a shy smile. "But you always have answers." "Not answers," I corrected gently. "Just more interesting questions." As my discharge date approached, concern grew among the medical team about my ability to live independently. My left side remained weaker than my right, and occasional bouts of dizziness raised safety concerns about navigating the farmhouse alone, particularly given its remote location and the winter conditions that often made Montana roads impassable. Robert and Janet offered to have me live with them, but their Hamilton home was a small ranch-style house ill-equipped for someone with mobility issues. We discussed hiring home health aides, installing medical alert systems, and modifying the farmhouse with ramps and grab bars, but the logistics and expense seemed increasingly daunting. "Mom, this changes everything," Thomas said during a rare visit to the rehabilitation center, Diane beside him scrolling through her phone with perfectly manicured nails. "You can't possibly manage that old house now. Diane and I have been talking, and we'd like you to come live with us in Seattle." The offer surprised me. Thomas and his wife had never shown interest in having me in their modern downtown condominium before, but I was touched by what seemed like filial concern and reluctantly agreed to a temporary arrangement while I continued recovering. "Just until I regain my strength," I stipulated. "The farmhouse stays as it is. I'll be returning to Montana." Thomas agreed, though something in his expression, a flicker of calculation I chose to ignore, should have warned me about what was to come. Instead, I focused on the practical aspects of the transition, arranging for Robert to check on the farmhouse regularly and asking my elderly neighbor, Harold Jensen, to continue harvesting from the orchard as he had during my hospitalization. The day before my scheduled departure for Seattle, Maria and Isabella came to say goodbye during their off hours. Isabella brought a small potted cutting from a native Montana serviceberry bush. "So you can have a piece of home with you," she explained, her dark eyes earnest. "They're really hardy. They can adapt to almost any conditions as long as you give them proper care." Maria handed me a sealed envelope. "My phone number and address," she explained. "Please stay in touch, Mrs. Sullivan. Your recovery journey doesn't end when you leave here." I hugged them both, surprised by the depth of connection I felt with these relative strangers who had shown me more genuine care than my own son had in years. "Thank you for everything," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For treating me like a person, not just a patient." "That's easy," Maria replied with her gentle smile. "You are a person worth knowing, Mrs. Sullivan." As Thomas helped me into his rental car the next morning, I glanced back at the rehabilitation facility with unexpected nostalgia. Despite the physical challenges and humiliations of recovery, I had found genuine human connection within those institutional walls, connections I now realized had been increasingly absent from my relationship with my only child. "Ready for your new life, Mom?" Thomas asked as he programmed the GPS for the Missoula airport. "Seattle's going to be a big change from all this." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding mountains and forests, his tone suggesting I was being rescued rather than relocated. I clutched the small serviceberry plant on my lap, its resilient branches a reminder of my own capacity for adaptation. "It's temporary," I reminded him and myself, "just until I'm stronger." He nodded absently, already checking emails on his phone at a stoplight. "Of course, Mom. Whatever you say." What I couldn't have known then as we drove away from the life I had built was how quickly temporary would become permanent in Thomas's mind, or how drastically my circumstances were about to change. The farmhouse that had sheltered 5 generations of Sullivans was already transforming in his imagination from cherished family homestead to valuable real estate investment, and I was becoming not a mother to be honored, but a complication to be managed. The seeds of the most difficult and ultimately most liberating decision of my life were already germinating, though I wouldn't recognize them until that shocking moment in my son's kitchen, when he suggested I move to the garden shed so they could convert my bedroom into a home gym. Seattle greeted me with persistent drizzle and a skyline of glass towers that reflected the gray sky in endless variations of silver and slate. Thomas and Diane lived in a luxury high-rise condominium in the Belltown neighborhood, their 27th floor unit offering panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the distant Olympic Mountains when the weather permitted. The condo was a study in contemporary minimalism, stark white walls, gleaming hardwood floors, and furniture that appeared designed more for architectural magazines than actual human comfort. Chrome, glass, and black leather dominated the space, with few personal touches beyond a wall of professional photographs showcasing Thomas and Diane at industry events and exotic vacation destinations. "This is the guest room," Thomas said, showing me to a spare bedroom that continued the apartment's austere aesthetic. A platform bed with a thin mattress occupied the center of the room, flanked by floating shelves and a single acrylic chair. The adjoining bathroom featured a shower stall with no grab bars and a vessel sink mounted atop a countertop too high for my post-stroke reach. "It's very modern," I offered, trying to mask my dismay at the impractical design for someone with mobility challenges. "We had the entire place remodeled last year," Diane mentioned, running her hand along the quartz countertop. "The designer is the same one who did that tech CEO's place in Architectural Digest." I placed Isabella's serviceberry plant on the windowsill, its rustic earthiness a stark contrast to the room's sterile perfection. "Will it get enough light here?" I wondered aloud, noting the surrounding skyscrapers that blocked direct sunlight. "Mom, plants are really not a priority," Thomas said with a hint of impatience. "Let's focus on getting you settled and discussing your therapy schedule. I've researched several rehabilitation centers in the area." That first evening established patterns that would define the coming weeks. Dinner was takeout from an upscale sushi restaurant, beautiful but bewildering to someone accustomed to hearty Montana fare. Conversation revolved around Thomas's latest project launch, Diane's marketing strategies, and their social engagements with Seattle's tech elite. When I mentioned the farmhouse or inquired about contacting Robert to check on things, Thomas would skillfully redirect the conversation. "That's all being handled, Mom. Let's focus on your recovery, not property management." Sleep eluded me that first night, my body aching for the familiar contours of my own bed, my ears straining for the sound of wind in pine trees instead of the distant hum of urban traffic. I missed the weight of handmade quilts, the creak of wooden floorboards, the sense of being held within walls that had sheltered generations. In their place was a sleek, temperature-controlled environment that felt as impersonal as a hotel room. The following weeks revealed that Thomas and Diane's lives had little room for an elderly parent with physical limitations. Both left early, each morning for their respective offices, returning late in the evening, often bringing work home with them. Their social calendar was filled with networking events, fundraising galas, and dinner parties, where a stroke-affected mother would be inconvenient to explain or accommodate. I was left largely to my own devices during the day, with a weekly visit from a home health aide arranged by Thomas's efficient assistant. The aide, a brisk young woman named Brittany, seemed perpetually rushed, checking off required tasks from her tablet with minimal engagement. "Everything good here, Mrs. Sullivan?" she would ask rhetorically, already noting patient report satisfaction with care before I could formulate a response. The apartment building had a concierge who could summon transportation if needed, but navigating Seattle's busy streets alone, with my unsteady gait and occasional episodes of confusion proved daunting. Increasingly, I found myself confined to the condo, watching ferries cross Elliott Bay and measuring time by the changing light patterns on the distant mountains. Physical therapy sessions 3 times weekly provided my only reliable human contact. My therapist, Dr. Kaplan, was a compassionate woman in her 50s who celebrated each small improvement with genuine enthusiasm. "You're making remarkable progress, Margaret," she encouraged during our 6th week of sessions. "Your left side strength has improved at least 30% since we started." "When do you think I might be ready to go home?" I asked, the farmhouse an ever-present longing in my heart. "To Montana, I mean." Dr. Kaplan's expression revealed a moment of hesitation. "Has your son discussed long-term living arrangements with you?" "Not specifically," I admitted. "He knows the plan was always for me to return once I'd recovered sufficiently." "Perhaps it's time for that conversation," she suggested gently. "From a clinical perspective, you're approaching a plateau where significant additional recovery becomes a longer-term process. The question now isn't about medical necessity, but about lifestyle adaptations." That evening, I broached the subject over another takeout dinner, this time from an upscale Thai restaurant whose spicy dishes remained largely untouched on my plate. "Dr. Kaplan thinks I'm reaching a recovery plateau," I began carefully. "I should start planning my return to Montana." Thomas and Diane exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. "Mom, we've actually been meaning to discuss this with you," Thomas said, setting down his smartphone. "Diane and I don't think returning to that isolated farmhouse is realistic anymore. I've managed quite well on my own for 20 years, I reminded him. And I'm regaining my strength, with some reasonable modifications to the house." "It's not just about physical capability," Thomas interrupted. "It's about practicality, finances, and your long-term care needs." "My finances are perfectly sound," I said, surprised by this new angle. "The farm is paid for, my pension is adequate, and I have good health insurance." Thomas leaned forward, adopting the tone he likely used when explaining complex technical concepts to non-technical colleagues. "Mom, the reality is that maintaining that property is draining resources you should be conserving for potential long-term care. The smart move would be to sell it while the market is strong and invest those funds for your future needs." "The farmhouse isn't an investment property," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's our family home. 5 generations of Sullivans have lived there. And the current generation of Sullivans lives in Seattle and Boston," Thomas D. countered, referring to himself and my brother's children, who had scattered across the country for their careers. "None of us are going back to run an apple orchard in Montana." "The decision isn't yours to make," I said quietly. "The farmhouse is my home, and I intend to return to it." Diane spoke up, her voice carrying the rehearsed compassion of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Margaret, we've spoken with an elder law attorney. Given your medical condition, there are legitimate questions about your capacity to manage independently. Thomas, as your only child, has both the right and responsibility to ensure appropriate arrangements for your care." The implication struck me like a physical blow. "Are you suggesting I'm mentally incompetent?" "Not incompetent," Thomas said quickly. "Just vulnerable. The stroke affected your cognitive function, Mom. You know that. There have been memory lapses, confusion about dates and times. Normal post-stroke symptoms that are improving," I insisted, feeling a growing sense of alarm. "Dr. Kaplan has documented my cognitive recovery in her reports." "The point is," Diane continued smoothly, "we're trying to make responsible decisions for everyone's benefit. The farmhouse is a valuable asset that's currently sitting empty, depreciating, without proper maintenance. Meanwhile, you need a living situation with appropriate support services." I looked from one to the other, suddenly seeing with painful clarity the calculation behind their solicitous care. "You want to sell my home?" Thomas had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. We want what's best for you, Mom. And yes, liquidating an underutilized asset to fund proper care seems like the responsible approach. I'm returning to Montana, I stated firmly, pushing back my chair. Now that I understand your intentions, I'll make arrangements immediately. That would be premature, Thomas replied, his voice hardening. We've already initiated the process for a guardian ad litem evaluation. Until that's resolved, major decisions about your residence or assets should remain on hold. The words hit me with stunning force. My own son was seeking legal authority to override my wishes and control my property. In that moment, the distance between us seemed unbridgeable. Not the physical miles separating Montana from Washington, but the vast expanse between our values and perspectives on what constituted a meaningful life. I see, I said, my voice barely audible as I struggled to process this betrayal. If you'll excuse me, I'm tired. We can continue this discussion tomorrow. In the privacy of the guest room, I allowed tears to flow freely for the first time since Gerald's death. Not tears of self-pity, but of grief for the son I thought I had raised. A son who now viewed his mother as an inconvenience, and her cherished home as merely an underutilized asset. Sleep eluded me that night as I considered my options. My condition was improving but not yet optimal. Travel alone would be challenging. My financial resources were in Montana banks, not easily accessible from Seattle. Most concerning, Thomas had apparently already begun legal proceedings that might restrict my autonomy. Morning brought no clarity, only a deepening sense of urgency. Thomas and Diane left for work with their usual brisk efficiency, mentioning they would be attending a charity gala that evening and would return late. We've ordered dinner delivery for you, Diane informed me. It should arrive around 6. Left alone in the sterile apartment, I found myself drawn to Thomas's home office, a space I'd been tacitly discouraged from entering. The room continued the minimalist aesthetic of the rest of the condo, but featured multiple computer monitors and a standing desk with precise cable management. I hesitated at the threshold, my traditional respect for privacy warring with growing concern about my son's intentions. Finally, necessity overcame hesitation. I entered the office and began carefully examining the papers on his desk, looking for evidence of the legal proceedings he had mentioned. The file was prominently labeled Sullivan Estate Planning, in Thomas's meticulously organized filing system. Inside, I found documents that confirmed my worst fears. Not just an application for guardianship based on alleged cognitive impairment, but a comprehensive plan for liquidating the farmhouse, projections for investment of the proceeds, and even a timeline for placing me in an assisted living facility by year's end. Most shocking was a real estate prospectus that had been prepared for the farmhouse property, emphasizing its development potential rather than its historical or agricultural value. Prime location for luxury vacation homes or boutique vineyard operation, the marketing materials proclaimed, accompanied by aerial photographs that reduced my beloved home to mere acreage and square footage. The final page contained notes from a meeting with a neuropsychologist whom I had never met, but who had apparently reviewed my medical records at Thomas's request. Patient's history suggests nostalgia-driven attachment to property may be clouding rational decision-making, the assessment concluded. Family-directed care plan addressing cognitive-emotional factors recommended. My hands trembled as I carefully replaced the documents exactly as I had found them. The betrayal was more calculated than I had imagined. Not a recent decision, but a plan developed over weeks, perhaps even before Thomas had offered to bring me to Seattle. I retreated to the guest room, my mind racing. Direct confrontation seemed unlikely to succeed. Thomas had clearly invested considerable effort in building a legal case for controlling my affairs. Returning to Montana immediately would be challenging given my physical limitations and lack of accessible funds. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I noticed Isabella's serviceberry plant on the windowsill, still alive despite minimal sunlight. its resilience a quiet rebuke to my growing sense of helplessness. Beside it lay my phone. And suddenly a possibility emerged from the fog of anxiety and betrayal. Maria had given me her contact information before I left Montana. Perhaps she could offer advice or support from a healthcare perspective, having witnessed my recovery journey firsthand. With fingers still unsteady from both emotion and stroke damage, I dialed her number. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Maria's warm voice answered on the third ring. "Is that really you? How wonderful to hear from you." The genuine pleasure in her tone broke something inside me. Tears flowed as I explained my situation. The discovery of Thomas's plans, my fear of losing my home and autonomy, my physical isolation in a city where I had no connections or support system. "This is terrible, Mrs. Sullivan," Maria said, her voice filled with concern. "Have you spoken with your brother about what's happening?" "Not yet," I admitted. "I've just discovered the extent of it today. And without access to my regular phone and address book, I don't even have Robert's new cell number memorized." "First things first," Maria said decisively. "You need independent legal advice before Thomas proceeds any further with this guardianship application. My cousin Eduardo is an attorney here in Missoula. He doesn't specialize in elder law, but he would know who to recommend." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from practical strategy to emotional support. Maria listened without judgment as I expressed not just fear, but profound disappointment in the son I had raised. "Parents give their children roots and wings," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes they fly so far they forget where they came from, but that doesn't diminish the value of the roots you provided." By the conversation's end, we had developed at least the outline of a plan. Maria would consult with her cousin about legal options. I would attempt to contact Robert through social media since I couldn't recall his phone number. Most importantly, I would not reveal to Thomas that I had discovered his plans, buying time to develop a more comprehensive response. "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan," Maria added before we ended the call. "Isabella has been asking about you. She's been helping Mr. Jensen with the apple harvest at your orchard. They've already collected nearly 40 bushels from the early varieties." The image of Maria's daughter among my apple trees my great-grandfather had planted, that I had tended for decades, sent a wave of longing through me so intense, it was almost physical pain. "Tell her thank you," I managed. "Tell her, those trees need young hands to care for them." "I will," Maria promised. "And Mrs. Sullivan, stay strong. You taught generations of students to observe, analyze, and respond to the natural world. Now you need to apply that same methodical approach to your own situation." After ending the call, I sat quietly, processing both the betrayal and the unexpected support that had emerged in response to it. The contrast between Thomas's clinical calculation and Maria's warm concern couldn't have been starker. One represented connection to my past and values. The other, a sterile vision of my future reduced to assets and care plans. Over the following days, I maintained a facade of normalcy. While working steadily on my escape plan, Eduardo connected me with Catherine Billings, an elder law attorney in Seattle, who agreed to meet me during one of my physical therapy appointments, providing legal counsel without Thomas's knowledge. "What your son is attempting constitutes elder abuse," Catherine stated bluntly after reviewing the documents I had photographed with my phone. "Financial exploitation cloaked in concern for your welfare. Unfortunately, it's a pattern I see with increasing frequency." "Can he succeed?" I asked, the question that had kept me awake through restless nights. "Potentially," she acknowledged. "Guardianship standards vary by jurisdiction, and the combination of your stroke history and his financial resources for expert testimony creates risk. But we have options, especially if we move quickly." Those options included countering them: guardianship petition with independent medical and psychological evaluations, securing my financial assets against potential freeze requests, and most importantly, returning to Montana where courts would likely be more sympathetic to my ties. To the property. The farmhouse deed is solely in your name? Catherine confirmed. Yes, my parents transferred it directly to me before their deaths. Thomas has never had any ownership interest. She nodded, making notes. That's important. We need to ensure it stays that way while we develop our strategy. Robert finally responded to my social media message, his shock and anger at Thomas's behavior evident even through digital communication. This is outrageous, Maggie, he wrote. Say the word and I'll drive to Seattle tomorrow to bring you home. I was tempted by the offer but counseled patience. Catherine had advised against any action that could be interpreted as impulsive or irrational, potentially reinforcing Thomas's narrative about my decision-making capacity. Instead, we needed to demonstrate thoughtful, deliberate steps to assert my autonomy. The breaking point came 3 weeks after my discovery of Thomas's plans. I had returned from physical therapy to find several suited individuals in the condo, measuring spaces and discussing renovation possibilities. Mom, you remember Diane's interior designer, Jason, Thomas said smoothly as I entered. He's helping us reimagine the space to better accommodate our evolving needs. Evolving needs? I echoed, noting the measuring tape extended across the guest room doorway. We've been thinking about your feedback about the guest room not being ideal for your mobility, Thomas explained, the lie flowing effortlessly. A full renovation might make more sense. Mrs. Sullivan, the designer interjected enthusiastically, we're envisioning transforming this bedroom into a state-of-the-art home gym with virtual training capabilities. The equipment we're considering is absolutely transformative. And where would I sleep during this transformation? I asked quietly. Thomas and Diane exchanged another of their practiced glances. We've been problem-solving that, Thomas said. The garden shed on the terrace could be converted into a comfortable studio space. I've already installed a space heater, and with some modest insulation. Mother, you'll need to move your things to the garden shed, my son announced as he and his wife stood in my kitchen. We're converting your bedroom into a home gym. It's perfectly adequate. I've even installed a space heater. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow, not just for their callous disregard of my needs, but for the absolute confirmation they provided of my son's true intentions. I was not a parent to be honored, but an inconvenience to be managed, my comfort and dignity secondary to their desire for a sleek exercise space in their already spacious home. In that moment, something shifted within me, a transformation from hurt to absolute clarity. The path forward crystallized with sudden, perfect certainty. I see, I said simply, my voice betraying none of the emotional turmoil beneath. When would this renovation begin? Surprised by my apparent acquiescence, Thomas launched into details about contractors and timelines, clearly relieved to avoid the confrontation he had anticipated. Diane began enthusiastically describing the high-end exercise equipment they planned to install, her eyes bright with consumerist fervor. I listened with practiced attentiveness, the skill of a teacher who had maintained engagement through thousands of classroom discussions. Inside, however, I was formulating not objections but escape plans, mentally cataloging the essential items I would need to pack, the phone calls I would need to make. That night, after Thomas and Diane had retired to their master suite, I sat at the small desk in the soon-to-be-eliminated guest room and made 3 critical calls. The first was to Catherine Billings, who answered despite the late hour. "It's time," I told her. "The situation has escalated. I need to execute our contingency plan immediately." The second call was to Robert, who had been on standby since our reconnection. "Tomorrow," I said simply. "The flight we discussed. Everything is prepared on your end." "All set, Maggie," he confirmed. "Janet has the guest room ready, and I've spoken with Dr. Lieberman about continuing your therapy in Hamilton." The third call was to Maria, whose steady support had been my lifeline throughout this ordeal. "It's happening," I told her. But I need one more favor, the most important one yet. After completing the calls, I opened my laptop to the document. Catherine had prepared a deed transfer for the farmhouse property. With careful deliberation, I filled in the final details, naming Maria Chavez as the recipient of the property transfer, with specific conditions outlined in the accompanying trust agreement. The farmhouse would remain in the Sullivan family in spirit, if not in name. Maria and Isabella would have lifetime residential rights, with the obligation to maintain the apple orchard and historical character of the property. Upon Maria's passing, the trust would transfer ownership to a conservation easement, ensuring the land would never be developed, with a scholarship fund established for Bitterroot Valley students pursuing agricultural or environmental studies. As Thomas and Diane slept in their minimalist bedroom, dreaming perhaps of their enhanced property value or streamlined lifestyle without an inconvenient elder requiring accommodation, I signed the documents that would forever remove the farmhouse from their grasp. This land has Sullivan blood and sweat in every acre, my father had said as he handed over the deed decades earlier. Keep it in the family. Keep it loved. Family, I had finally come to understand, was not always defined by blood relation. Sometimes it was found in the kindness of a night nurse who saw your humanity when you were at your most vulnerable. Sometimes it was discovered in the enthusiasm of a teenage girl who cherished the very traditions your own child had rejected. I closed the laptop and began quietly packing the few possessions I had brought to Seattle, along with Isabella's resilient serviceberry plant, a small piece of Montana that had survived, like me, in inhospitable conditions through sheer determination to endure. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, recrimination, perhaps even legal challenges to the decisions I had made this night. But for the first time since I had awoken in that hospital bed with half my body rebelling against my commands, I felt fully in control of my destiny. Not despite my limitations, but because I had learned to navigate around them with the help of those who truly cared for my well-being. In the morning, I would leave this sterile apartment for the last time. I would return to Montana not to the farmhouse itself, but to my brother's home while the legal process unfolded. And when Thomas eventually discovered that the property he had coveted was beyond his reach forever, I hoped he might finally understand what I had tried to teach him throughout his childhood. That true value lies not in assets, but in connections, not in what you possess, but in what you preserve. The garden shed with its inadequate space heater would remain empty. The deed to a century-old farmhouse would rest in the hands of someone who understood its worth beyond market value. And I, Margaret Sullivan, having lost a son but found a different kind of family, would continue the journey of recovery on my own terms, in the landscape that had shaped generations of Sullivans before me and would nurture new stewards in the generations to come. Morning arrived with pale Seattle light filtering through the guest room blinds. I had slept little, my mind cycling through the plan I had set in motion, checking for weaknesses or oversights. The small suitcase I had brought from Montana stood packed by the door, containing only essentials, clothing for a few days, medications, important documents, and the few mementos I had brought to this sterile place that had never felt like home. Isabella's serviceberry plant, now carefully wrapped for travel, sat atop the suitcase like a standard-bearer for my rebellion. The legal documents Catherine had prepared were safely tucked into a folder in my handbag, copies already scanned and emailed to multiple secure accounts beyond Thomas's reach. I dressed with particular care that morning, choosing a tailored outfit that had always given me confidence in the classroom. A navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, comfortable but presentable slacks, and practical shoes suitable for navigating airport concourses. I applied light makeup, arranging my silver hair neatly, determined to project the image of a composed, competent woman rather than a frail elder in need of management. When I emerged from the guest room, Thomas and Diane were already at the kitchen island. He scrolling through emails on his tablet while she measured precise amounts of protein powder into a blender. "Good morning," I said, my voice betraying none of the emotion churning beneath my calm exterior. "I hope you both slept well." Thomas glanced up, his expression shifting from digital absorption to mild surprise at my formal appearance. "You're dressed early. Do you have therapy today?" "No," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee from their elaborate brewing system. "Robert is coming to take me back to Montana." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Thomas fully processed its implications. His expression hardened, tablet forgotten as he straightened to his full height. "What are you talking about? We discussed this, Mom. Montana isn't an option anymore." "You discussed it," I corrected him gently. "I never agreed." Diane abandoned her breakfast preparation, moving to stand alongside my son in a united front. "Margaret, this is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making that concerns us. You can't possibly manage independent living in your condition." "My condition," I echoed, taking a deliberate sip of coffee, "has been evaluated by my regular physicians, who support my return with appropriate accommodations. Dr. Kaplan has provided documentation to that effect." Thomas's expression darkened. Further, "You've been making medical appointments without informing us? Going behind our backs to take responsibility for my own healthcare decisions?" I interrupted, my voice remaining calm despite the accelerating pace of my heart. "Yes, Thomas, that's what competent adults do." "This is ridiculous," he snapped, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Winters right now. The guardianship hearing is scheduled for next week, and this behavior only reinforces the need for intervention. Catherine Billings has already filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition," I informed him, taking a certain satisfaction in the shock that registered on his face at the mention of my attorney's name. "She's also prepared to file elder abuse charges if necessary." "Elder abuse?" Diane's perfectly maintained brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Thomas has done nothing but try to help you." "Financial exploitation is a form of elder abuse," I explained as though addressing particularly slow students. "As is attempting to isolate an elder from their support systems and established community. As is threatening to relocate someone to a garden shed so you can install exercise equipment in their bedroom." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "That was a temporary solution during renovations intended to improve the living space for you." "We both know that's not true," I said quietly. "We both know you never intended for me to return to Montana. We both know the guardianship petition was part of a larger strategy to gain control of the farmhouse property." "That's absurd," he blustered, but his eyes shifted away from mine, unable to maintain contact in the face of truth. "The only reason we've discussed selling the property is to ensure adequate resources for your long-term care." "My financial resources are more than adequate," I countered, "as Catherine has documented extensively for the court. But this conversation is academic at this point. Robert will be here within the hour to take me to the airport." "I won't allow this," Thomas declared, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he likely used with junior employees. "You're not thinking clearly, and until the court makes its determination, you should remain here under supervision." "I am not under any legal restriction," I reminded him. "The guardianship petition has not been granted. I am a fully competent adult making decisions about my own living arrangements." "We'll see about that," he muttered, stepping away to make a phone call, his voice low and urgent as he presumably contacted his attorney. Diane attempted a different approach, her marketing background evident in the swift pivot to emotional manipulation. "Margaret, we're only thinking of your well-being. This house in Montana, it's just a building. Family is what matters, and your family is here." The statement was so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. "My family? The people who would relocate me to a garden shed rather than inconvenience themselves? The people who have spent weeks plotting to take my home while pretending to care for my recovery?" That's not fair, she protested. We've opened our home to you. You've tolerated my presence while developing a comprehensive plan to control my assets, I corrected her. There's a significant difference. Thomas returned, his expression grim but somewhat satisfied. I've spoken with our attorney. He's filing an emergency petition for temporary guardianship based on your current erratic behavior. Until that's resolved, you should remain here. No court will grant an emergency petition without evidence of immediate danger, I responded, Catherine's coaching evident in my confident reply. Returning to my home state to live with my brother hardly constitutes endangerment. The doorbell's chime interrupted our standoff. Thomas moved to answer it, clearly expecting his attorney, or perhaps some legal representative. Instead, he found himself face to face with Robert, my brother's weathered rancher's build forming an imposing figure in the doorway. Tommy, Robert greeted him, using the childhood nickname Thomas had long since abandoned. I'm here for Maggie. Thomas attempted to block the entrance. This isn't a good time, Uncle Robert. Mom's been making some concerning decisions lately, and we're in the process of addressing them legally. Robert, never one for pretense, simply laughed. That right? Seems to me the only concerning decision Maggie made was trusting you with her well-being. He stepped forward, forcing Thomas to either move aside or create a physical confrontation. I believe my sister is expecting me. Seeing Robert, sun-weathered, solid, so reminiscent of our father with his direct gaze and no-nonsense demeanor, released something tight and anxious in my chest. Here was family in the truest sense, not defined by legal obligations or inheritance expectations, but by shared history and genuine concern. Ready to go home, Maggie? He asked, crossing the living room to embrace me warmly. More than ready, I confirmed, returning his hug with fierce gratitude. Thomas shifted tactics, his voice taking on a reasonable, concerned tone. Uncle Robert, I understand your intentions are good, but Mom has suffered cognitive effects from her stroke. Her doctors here have recommended against independent living, especially in an isolated rural setting. Interesting, Robert replied, mildly. Because I've spoken with her rehabilitation team in Missoula, and they seem quite confident in her recovery trajectory. In fact, Dr. Lieberman is looking forward to continuing her therapy in Hamilton. You don't understand the legal complications, Thomas persisted. There's a guardianship petition pending, which Catherine Billings is handling quite competently, I interjected, retrieving my suitcase from the guest room. She'll contact you through proper legal channels regarding any necessary communications. Going forward. Thomas's expression hardened as he realized persuasion had failed. This is a mistake, Mom. A serious, potentially irreversible mistake. No, Thomas, I said, pausing at the door to face my son directly. The mistake was believing you valued my happiness above your financial interests. The mistake was forgetting to teach you that homes aren't just assets, and parents aren't just obligations. Something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps recognition, perhaps merely calculation of his next strategic move. What about the farmhouse? We need to discuss. The farmhouse is no longer your concern, I informed him, a strange calm settling over me as I delivered the news that would sever his last reason for maintaining contact with me. I've transferred ownership to ensure it remains protected from development. Catherine can provide the details to your attorney. His face drained of color. You can't do that. You don't have the authority to. I have every authority, as the sole owner of the property, I corrected him. The transfer was completed and filed last night. It's done, Thomas. To whom? He demanded, voice rising. Who did you give my inheritance to? The possessive claim, my inheritance, confirmed everything I had come to understand about his motivations. The farmhouse had never been his home in his heart. It had merely been a future asset in his portfolio, a commodity to be liquidated when the time was right. To someone who values its history and purpose, I answered simply. Someone who will preserve rather than profit from it. Diane stepped forward, attempting to salvage the situation. Margaret, clearly we've had a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should all sit down and— There's no misunderstanding, I interrupted gently. But there is a flight to catch. Robert took my suitcase, tucking the serviceberry plant carefully under his other arm. The car's waiting downstairs, Maggie. As we moved toward the door, Thomas made one final attempt. Mom, if you leave like this, if you go through with this property transfer, you'll regret it. Some relationships can't be repaired once broken. I turned to face my son one last time, seeing beyond his current anger to the child I had raised, the man he had become, and the unbridgeable gap between my values and his ambitions. You're right about that, Thomas. Some relationships can't be repaired once broken, like trust, like respect, like the belief that your child sees you as more than a financial resource to be managed. With that, Robert and I left the condominium, the door closing behind us with a quiet finality more profound than any dramatic slam could have conveyed. In the elevator descending to the lobby, I leaned against my brother's solid shoulder, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. You okay, Maggie? He asked, concern evident in his gruff voice. I will be, I assured him, straightening my shoulders as the elevator reached the ground floor. I've done what needs doing. Now, I just need to go home. About that, Robert said carefully as we crossed the marble-floored lobby. Janet and I are happy to have you stay with us as long as you need, but I understand you've made other arrangements for the farmhouse. I have, I confirmed. I'll explain everything on the flight. The journey from Seattle to Missoula passed, in a blur of airport security accommodations, pressurized cabin air, and the steady drone of engines that somehow matched the humming anxiety in my chest. Robert listened without interruption as I explained my decision to transfer the farmhouse to Maria, the structure of the trust ensuring the property's preservation, and my plan to find a small apartment in Hamilton near his family while I continued my recovery. It's an unusual solution, he acknowledged when I finished. But then again, it's an unusual situation. Thomas gave you no choice but to protect the property from his plans. I still can't quite believe it came to this, I admitted, watching Montana's familiar landscape emerge through breaks in the cloud cover below. Where did I go wrong with him, Robert? How did he become someone who would put his mother in a garden? She'd to make room for exercise equipment? Robert considered the question with the thoughtful deliberation that had always characterized him. You didn't go wrong, Maggie. You and Gerald gave that boy every advantage. Material comfort, educational, opportunity, emotional security. But values can't be forced. They can only be modeled. Thomas chose his path long ago, when he decided that success meant accumulation rather than contribution. I keep thinking if I'd done something differently, he shook his head firmly. That's not on you. Parents give their children roots and wings, like Maria said. What they do with those wings is their choice. Thomas has been flying toward a different horizon than the one you hoped for him, but that doesn't diminish what you provided. The Missoula airport greeted us with the crisp autumn air and mountain vistas I had missed during my Seattle confinement. As we emerged from the terminal, I spotted a familiar figure waiting in the pickup area, Maria standing beside an older model SUV, her face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of us. Mrs. Sullivan, she called, hurrying forward to embrace me with genuine affection. Welcome home. The simple greeting brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Home. Not yet to the farmhouse itself, but to the landscape that had shaped generations of my family, to people who valued me for who I was rather than what I possessed. Thank you for everything, I said, returning her embrace. I don't know how I can ever repay what you've done. There's nothing to repay, she insisted, helping Robert load my modest luggage into the vehicle. Friends support each other, that's all. The drive from Missoula to Hamilton took us through the Bitterroot Valley, its familiar contours a balm to my soul after months away. The cottonwoods along the river were turning golden, contrasting with the evergreen forests that climbed the mountainsides. Russet apples hung heavy in roadside orchards, and the afternoon light cast the landscape in the amber glow that had always signaled autumn's arrival in western Montana. We passed the turnoff to the farmhouse, and I felt a momentary pang at not continuing down that familiar gravel lane. But the decision had been made, the papers signed, the transfer completed. The farmhouse was no longer legally mine, though it would always remain mine in spirit. "Isabella is there now," Maria mentioned, noting my gaze toward the turnoff. "She's been helping Mr. Jensen bring in the last of the apple harvest. They've pressed nearly 60 gallons of cider already." The thought of the harvest continuing, of the land's rhythms proceeding regardless of legal ownership or family discord, provided unexpected comfort. The farmhouse and orchard had never truly belonged to any individual Sullivan. We had been temporary stewards of something larger than ourselves, a continuum of care and cultivation that extended beyond any single lifetime. Robert and Janet's home in Hamilton was a modest ranch-style house with thoughtful modifications already in place for my arrival. Grab bars in the bathroom, a ramp alongside the front steps, the guest room arranged with clear pathways for someone with mobility challenges. "We want you comfortable while you decide on your next steps," Janet explained as she showed me to the room. "No rush, Maggie. Stay as long as you need." That first evening, sitting on their back deck watching twilight settle over the Bitterroot Mountains, I felt a profound mixture of grief and liberation. I had lost my son. Not to death, but to values so divergent from mine that reconciliation seemed impossible. I had relinquished legal ownership of the home that had sheltered 5 generations of my family. Yet alongside these losses was the surprising lightness of having acted in accordance with my deepest principles, of having chosen preservation over profit, relationship over resource. "Penny for your thoughts," Robert said, joining me with mugs of hot cider pressed from our family orchard. "I was just thinking about great-grandfather James," I replied, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. What he would make of all this, his homestead passing out of Sullivan hands after more than a century. Robert considered this, his weathered face thoughtful in the fading light. "I think he'd understand better than most. Remember the story Dad used to tell? How James chose that land not for its timber value or mineral rights, but for the way the evening light hit the apple trees he'd planted." I nodded, the family legend as familiar as my own reflection. "Some things matter more than names on deeds," Robert continued. "The land being loved, the trees being tended, the history being honored. That's what would matter to James. And that's what you've ensured." 3 days later, Catherine called with news from Seattle. "Thomas has filed an objection to the property transfer," she informed me, "claiming you lacked capacity to make the decision due to your medical condition." "Will it succeed?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Extremely unlikely," she assured me. "We have thorough documentation of your cognitive capacity from multiple medical professionals. More importantly, the trust structure you established demonstrates sophisticated financial and estate planning consistent with your stated values and historic priorities. That's hardly the action of someone lacking capacity. What happens next?" "There will be a hearing in Montana, since that's where the property is located. Thomas will need to travel there to present his case, an inconvenience I suspect he'll resent. Given the evidence we've assembled, I expect his petition to be dismissed fairly rapidly." She was right. The hearing was scheduled for late October, in the Ravalli County Courthouse, the same building where I had taken school groups on civics field trips for decades. Thomas arrived with an imposing legal team, their sleek urban attire conspicuous among the more casual dress of local attorneys and court personnel. I sat with Catherine at the respondents' table, Robert and Janet directly behind me in the gallery. Maria and Isabella occupied seats nearby, their presence a testament to the unconventional family bonds that had formed through this ordeal. Thomas avoided my gaze throughout the proceedings, focusing intently on his attorney's presentations about my concerning behavior and susceptibility to undue influence following my stroke. Their arguments painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman manipulated by opportunistic caregivers, a narrative so divorced from reality that it might have been comical had it not been so deliberately cruel. When my turn came to address the court, I rose slowly, determined to demonstrate both my physical improvement and my mental clarity. The judge, Eleanor Blackwood, had been one of my students in the 1990s, though professional ethics prevented her from acknowledging our prior connection during the proceedings. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said formally, "would you like to explain your decision regarding the property transfer?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady. "The farmhouse has been in my family for 5 generations. Throughout that time, it has served as both a home and a working apple orchard, an important part of the Bitterroot Valley's agricultural heritage. My son's documented plans involved selling the property for development, destroying both its historical significance and ecological value." I explained the structure of the trust, emphasizing the conservation easement that would permanently protect the land from development, the educational component that would provide scholarships for local students, and the residential rights that would ensure the property remained a working orchard rather than a museum piece. This arrangement honors my family's legacy far more meaningfully than maintaining technical ownership while allowing the property to be eventually sold and developed, I concluded. The decision was made with full understanding of its implications, and in accordance with values I have maintained throughout my life. Judge Blackwood considered this thoughtfully before turning to Thomas's lead attorney. "Counselor, your client's objection centers on his mother's capacity to make this decision. Yet the medical documentation and Mrs. Sullivan's testimony today demonstrate clear cognitive function and decision-making consistent with her established priorities. What evidence do you have of incapacity beyond the mere fact that your client disagrees with her choice?" The attorney fumbled through arguments about age-related judgment deficits and emotional attachment clouding rational assessment, but the weakness of their position became increasingly apparent as the judge continued her pointed questioning. When Thomas finally took the stand, his testimony revealed more about his own priorities than my alleged incapacity. "This property represents a significant family asset," he emphasized repeatedly. "As her only child, I have a responsibility to ensure it isn't devalued through sentimental decisions." "And what were your plans for the property, had the guardianship been granted?" Judge Blackwood asked. Thomas hesitated, clearly weighing how honest to be in his response. "Professional assessment of the highest and best use of the asset," he finally stated, "which preliminary evaluations suggested would involve subdividing for residential development." "Residential development," the judge repeated, "of the orchard that's been in continuous operation since 1897. With current agricultural profit margins, continued operation as an orchard represents significant opportunity cost," Thomas replied, the corporate jargon revealing how completely he viewed the situation through a financial rather than familial lens. Judge Blackwood needed less than 30 minutes of deliberation before delivering her decision. "The court finds no evidence of incapacity in Margaret Sullivan's decision-making process regarding the property transfer. On the contrary, the trust structure demonstrates sophisticated understanding of legal mechanisms to achieve her stated goals of historic preservation and continued agricultural use. The objection is dismissed, and the transfer shall stand as executed." She paused, removing her glasses as she addressed Thomas directly. "Mr. Sullivan, while I understand your disappointment at what you perceive as lost financial opportunity, I would encourage you to consider the non-monetary value of your family's historic property. Some legacies can't be measured in market comparables or investment returns." Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight gilded the changing leaves of maple trees planted along Main Street. Thomas emerged with his legal team, briefcases in hand, headed directly for the rental cars that would return them to Missoula's airport and then to Seattle. For a moment, Our eyes met across the courthouse steps. I saw in his expression not remorse or understanding, but calculation, weighing whether further legal challenges might be worth the investment, whether any relationship with me retained sufficient value to maintain. "Thomas," I called, taking a step toward him despite Robert's restraining hand on my arm. He paused, his posture stiff with suppressed anger. "The legal avenues aren't exhausted," he said by way of greeting. "This could be appealed." "It could," I acknowledged. "But is that really the relationship you want with me going forward? Courtroom confrontations and legal maneuvers?" He adjusted his tie, a gesture that reminded me painfully of Gerald preparing for parent-teacher conferences decades earlier. "You've made your choices clear, Mother. You chose strangers over family." "No," I corrected gently. "I chose preservation over profit. And the people I've entrusted with our family legacy aren't strangers. They're individuals who demonstrate the values I spent my life trying to instill: respect for history, care for the land, concern for future generations. Poetic justifications don't change the fact that you've disinherited your only child," he countered, bitterness evident in every word. "The farmhouse was never an inheritance, Thomas. It was a responsibility, one you made clear you didn't value, or want except as a financial asset. I found someone who sees it as I do, not as a commodity, but as a living legacy." His expression hardened further. "I hope you're satisfied with your decision, Mother. Diane and I won't be making the trip to Montana again." "I'm sorry for that," I said, meaning it despite everything. "But my door, wherever it may be, remains open if you ever change your perspective." He turned away without further comment, striding toward the waiting car where Diane sat checking her phone, already mentally returned to the Seattle world that had always been their true home. I watched them drive away, a complex mixture of emotions washing through me: grief for the relationship that seemed irretrievably broken, sadness for the grandson my son had become, yet underneath it all, a quiet certainty that I had made the necessary choice, however painful its consequences. Maria and Isabella approached hesitantly, having given me space for the attempted reconciliation. "Mrs. Sullivan," Maria said gently, "are you ready to go?" I nodded, turning away from the departing car to face those who had become, against all expectation, my chosen family. "Yes," I replied. "I think it's time to visit the farmhouse." The drive down the familiar gravel lane brought a flood of memories, arriving as a newlywed with Gerald, bringing infant Thomas home from the hospital, teaching generations of students about apple varieties during field trips to the orchard, saying final goodbyes to my parents and later to my husband beneath the ancient trees that had witnessed it all. The farmhouse stood as it always had, white clapboard gleaming in the autumn, sunshine, wraparound porch extending its welcome, the orchard beyond heavy with ripening fruit. Only now there were signs of new care: fresh paint on the window trim, flower boxes brimming with hardy mums, the wheelchair ramp Gerald had built for my father's final years repaired and reinforced. "Isabella has been working on the accessibility features," Maria explained as we parked beside the barn. She researched universal design principles for her science project. Isabella emerged from the orchard, carrying a basket of apples, her dark hair caught back in a practical ponytail, her expression brightening at the sight of our arrival. "Mrs. Sullivan," she called, setting down the basket to hurry forward. "Did everything go okay at court?" "Better than okay," I assured her, accepting her enthusiastic hug. "The judge upheld the transfer. The farmhouse and orchard are officially protected by the trust." "Come see what we've done with the kitchen garden," she urged, her enthusiasm for the land matching my own at her age. "Mr. Jensen helped me install raised beds so you can garden from a wheelchair or standing position, depending on your strength each day." As Isabella led us toward the garden, chattering about heirloom seed varieties and companion planting techniques, Maria hung back slightly, watching me with perceptive eyes. "How are you really doing?" she asked quietly. "With your son, I considered the question honestly, watching Isabella's animated gestures as she explained the garden modifications. "I've lost something precious," I acknowledged. "A relationship I thought would sustain me through my final years. But I've also gained something unexpected, the certainty that this land will continue to be loved and tended as it deserves." Maria nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions behind my words. "The conditions in the trust, you know they're not necessary, right? Isabella and I would never sell or develop this place. We understand what it means to you." "I know," I assured her. "But legal protections ensure the land's safety beyond our lifetimes. This way, no future owner can undo what 5 generations have built, no matter how persuasive the financial incentives might be." We stood together, watching Isabella examine a ripening apple with the same careful attention I had once devoted to selecting the perfect specimen for county fair entries. Though not related by blood, she embodied the reverence for the land and thirst for knowledge that had characterized the best of Sullivan traditions. "Mrs. Sullivan," Maria said hesitantly, "Isabella and I have been discussing living arrangements. The trust gives us residential rights, but we'd never presume to displace you from your family home." "It's not my home legally anymore," I reminded her, "though it will always be in my heart." "What we were thinking," she continued, "is that perhaps you might consider moving back here rather than finding an apartment in Hamilton. The first floor is already largely accessible and with some minor modifications." She trailed off, seemingly unsure if the suggestion overstepped. The possibility caught me by surprise. I had assumed the transfer meant my own permanent relocation, a necessary sacrifice to ensure the property's protection. "You'd want me here, as a housemate." "More than a housemate," Isabella called, having overheard our conversation. "We need you here, Mrs. Sullivan. Who else is going to teach me all the secrets of these apple trees? Mr. Jensen says some of these varieties aren't even in books anymore. The knowledge only exists in your head." "Besides," Maria added with a smile, 3 generations under one roof is traditional in my culture. The wisdom of elders is considered a blessing, not a burden." I looked from mother to daughter, then to the farmhouse that had witnessed my entire life story, my childhood play, my parents' aging, my marriage, my widowhood, and now this unexpected new chapter. The property was no longer mine on paper, but its essence remained intertwined with my identity in ways legal documents could never capture or constrain. "I would be honored," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "If you're certain there's room." "Room?" Isabella laughed. "There are 5 bedrooms, Mrs. Sullivan. And Mr. Jensen says we need to start planning which new varieties to graft next spring. He says you're the only one who understands the specific microclimate of the North Orchard slope." As we walked together toward the house, Maria adjusting her pace to match my post-stroke gait, Isabella running ahead to open doors and clear pathways, I felt a profound sense of continuity, despite the legal and familial ruptures of recent months. The farmhouse would never again be home to a Sullivan. By name, the blood connection had been broken by Thomas's choices and my necessary response. Yet something more essential continued uninterrupted. The care for the land, the preservation of knowledge, the passing of wisdom across generations. 3 months. Earlier, I had been told to sleep in a garden shed while my son converted my bedroom to a home gym. That night, I had signed away legal ownership of my family's century-old farmhouse, transferring the deed to someone outside our bloodline, but firmly within our value system. Now, standing on the familiar porch as autumn light gilded the orchard, beyond, I understood that I had lost nothing that truly mattered. The property remained preserved. The trees continued bearing fruit. And I had found, in the most unexpected circumstances, a new family bonded not by genetics, but by shared reverence for the things most worth preserving. "Come inside, Mrs. Sullivan," Isabella called from the doorway, her smile reflecting the same joy I had felt as a child in this very spot. We've got fresh cider pressing and so much to plan for next season's planting. I stepped across the threshold, returning home in all the ways that truly mattered. Winter descended on the Bitterroot Valley with characteristic Montana intensity. By mid-November, snow draped the orchard in pristine white, transforming gnarled apple trees into crystalline sculptures against the backdrop of mountains. Inside the farmhouse, life had settled into new rhythms that honored old traditions while embracing unexpected change. The first floor had been thoughtfully modified to accommodate my post-stroke needs. My former sewing room, adjacent to the kitchen, had been converted into a comfortable bedroom with an adjoining bathroom featuring grab bars and a walk-in shower. The kitchen itself remained largely unchanged. The same sturdy oak table where 5 generations of Sullivans had shared meals now hosted our blended household, for everything from breakfast conversations to evening card games. Maria worked 3 12-hour shifts each week at the rehabilitation center in Missoula, commuting the 45 miles in her reliable SUV regardless of weather. On her days off, she tended to the household with quiet efficiency, filling the kitchen with aromas of both traditional Montana fare I'd taught her and Guatemalan dishes that had become welcome additions to our menu. Isabella attended the local high school, the same institution where I had taught for over 4 decades. Her initial nervousness about being the new girl quickly dissolved as she found her place among the rural community's teenagers, joining the science club, volunteering with the 4-H program, and developing a particular interest in sustainable agriculture that connected directly to our orchard's heritage. My days were structured around continued rehabilitation, physical therapy sessions 3 times weekly, cognitive exercises recommended by my neurologist, and the gradual resumption of activities adapted to my new capabilities. Though my left side remained weaker than my right, I had progressed from walker to cane and could manage most household tasks with minimal accommodation. More fulfilling than physical recovery was the opportunity to pass on knowledge I had feared might die with me. Isabella proved an eager apprentice in everything from apple cultivation to local ecology, absorbing information with the voracious curiosity I remembered from my own youth. The Sullivan russet was developed by your great-grandfather, I explained one snowy afternoon as we sorted apple varieties preserved in the root cellar. It's unique to this orchard, a natural cross between a northern spy and something he never discovered as a chance seedling near the creek. Isabella held the distinctive russet-skinned apple reverently, as if cradling a historical artifact. So this variety exists nowhere else in the world? As far as we know, I confirmed. Commercial orchards focus on standardized varieties with predictable characteristics and shipping durability. Family orchards like ours often maintained heirloom varieties or local specialties that never entered wider cultivation. We should document everything, she declared with adolescent conviction. Record all the varieties, their histories, cultivation, requirements. Create a database before the knowledge is lost. Her enthusiasm sparked a project that came to occupy our winter evenings. A comprehensive catalog of the orchard's 27 apple varieties, complete with photographs, historical notes, culinary uses, and cultivation requirements. Isabella's facility with technology complemented my historical knowledge, resulting in both digital records and a handwritten journal continuing the documentation my grandfather had begun in the 1920s. As December arrived, the question of holiday celebrations arose. In previous years, I had journeyed to Seattle for an increasingly uncomfortable Christmas with Thomas and Diane, or hosted Robert's family at the farmhouse for a traditional Montana gathering. This year, everything had changed. We don't want to impose on your family traditions, Maria said carefully one evening as we planned the week ahead. If you prefer to spend Christmas with your brother's family, you are my family now, I interrupted, gently, not replacing my blood relations but adding to them. I'd like to spend Christmas here with both of you, And perhaps invite Robert and Janet to join us if you're comfortable with that. The relief in Maria's expression was palpable. We would love that. In Guatemala, Christmas was always our most important family gathering. Isabella and I haven't had a proper celebration since coming to the States. Then we'll create new traditions that honor all our backgrounds, I decided. Though I draw the line at synthetic Christmas trees. Sullivans have always cut their own from the North Woods. Isabella, entering from her homework session in the dining room, caught the end of our conversation. Can we really cut our own tree? Like, legally? Her question made me laugh, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that I realized had been absent from my life for too long. With a $5 permit from the Forest Service and generations of family practice, yes. Your Montana education begins with proper Christmas tree selection. 2 days later, Robert arrived with his ancient pickup truck to continue what had been a Sullivan tradition since my childhood. The four of us ventured into the national forest land adjoining the northern property border, trudging through knee-deep snow in search of the perfect Douglas fir. Isabella's delight in this simple ritual, tramping through pristine wilderness, assessing candidate trees from every angle, finally selecting and harvesting our choice, reminded me that traditions retain their power when shared with those who approach them with fresh appreciation. The farmhouse gradually transformed with holiday decorations retrieved from the attic, ornaments crafted by 4 generations of Sullivan children, strings of lights that had illuminated countless Christmas Eves, hand-embroidered stockings bearing names I traced with remembrance: William, Elizabeth, Gerald, Margaret, Thomas. When I unwrapped Thomas's stocking, crafted during my pregnancy, with meticulous love and anticipation, I paused, uncertain. His clear rejection of both me and the values the farmhouse represented made displaying it feel somehow false, yet storing it away seemed a final admission that our relationship was irretrievably broken. Maria, observing my hesitation, approached quietly. "Family relationships are rarely simple, Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "especially between parents and children. The door remains open, even when not currently walked through." I nodded, carefully hanging Thomas's stocking alongside the others. "Hope, without expectation," I murmured. "A difficult balance to maintain." "But one worth attempting," she replied with the gentle wisdom that had drawn me to her from our first meeting in the rehabilitation center. As Christmas approached, Robert's family joined our preparations. His grandchildren delighted to help string popcorn garlands and cut paper snowflakes. Janet, initially reserved around Maria and Isabella, gradually warmed as they worked together in the kitchen, traditional Sullivan recipes commingling with Maria's Guatemalan specialties in a literal melting pot of cultural exchange. The holiday itself unfolded with unexpected joy. Presents thoughtfully selected for preferences rather than obligation, meals that accommodated diverse tastes while honoring heritage, conversations that flowed without the undercurrent of tension that had characterized recent family gatherings. Late Christmas evening, as we sat around the fire watching snowflakes dance beyond frosted windows, Robert raised his glass of my father's traditional mulled cider in a toast. "To family," he said simply, "both born and chosen." The sentiment captured perfectly what had emerged from the previous month's turmoil, a recognition that family transcended legal definitions or blood connections, encompassing all who shared fundamental values and genuine care for one another. January brought new developments on multiple fronts. My physical recovery continued steadily, my neurologist expressing satisfaction with my progress, while cautioning that some effects of the stroke would likely remain permanent. "You've regained approximately 80% of your pre-stroke function," Dr. Lieberman explained during my quarterly assessment. "That's exceptional for someone your age. The remaining deficits, some left-side weakness, occasional word-finding difficulties, will likely persist, but shouldn't significantly impact your quality of life with proper accommodations." Isabella received notification that her science, Project documenting the orchard's heirloom varieties had been selected as a regional finalist in the state science fair. They want me to present in Helena in March, she announced breathlessly one afternoon, waving the official letter. The judges are specifically interested in the biodiversity preservation aspects and potential applications for climate adaptation in commercial orchiding. Her achievement filled me with vicarious pride tinged with sweet nostalgia. I had coached countless students through similar competitions during my teaching career, but never with the personal connection I felt to Isabella's project, which represented a genuine continuation of Sullivan family knowledge. Most significant was the official registration of the Sullivan Orchard Heritage Trust with the state of Montana and relevant conservation authorities. The legal structure Catherine had helped establish was now fully operational, ensuring the property would remain a working orchard and educational resource in perpetuity, regardless of who held residential rights or managed day-to-day operations. It's the best possible outcome, Robert acknowledged as we reviewed the final documentation. The land stays intact, the agricultural heritage continues, and future generations benefit from both the physical space and the educational opportunities. Though Thomas may never see it that way, I noted, the lingering sadness of that broken relationship never entirely absent, despite my certainty in the rightness of my decision. His loss? Robert said simply. Some people never learn to value what truly matters. February brought a letter from Seattle, not from Thomas, as I had occasionally allowed myself to hope, but from my daughter-in-law Diane. The envelope, addressed in her precise handwriting, contained a formal note on monogrammed stationery. Margaret. It began with characteristic formality. I'm writing to inform you that Thomas and I have separated. Our divorce proceedings are underway, with expected completion by summer. This development doesn't change Thomas's position regarding the Montana property situation, but as a courtesy, I wanted you to know of this significant change in our family structure. The remainder of the letter contained practical details about contact information changes and a coolly polite conclusion wishing me continued recovery. No explanation for the marriage's dissolution was offered, though I couldn't help wondering if the failed attempt to secure the farmhouse property had played some role in increasing tensions already present in their relationship. I shared the news with Maria that evening after Isabella had gone to study at a friend's house. I can't pretend to be entirely surprised, I admitted, as we sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of herbal tea. Their values seemed aligned in most ways, but marriages rarely survive the strain of failed financial gambles. Are you considering reaching out to Thomas? She asked, her expression reflecting neither judgment nor expectation. I sighed, tracing the wood grain of the oak table that had witnessed so many family discussions throughout the decades. I'm not sure what purpose it would serve. His anger runs deep, and from his perspective, I've deprived him of a significant inheritance. Unless his fundamental values have shifted, any reconciliation would be superficial at best. Yet you keep his stocking among the family Christmas decorations, she observed gently. Hope without expectation, I repeated my earlier wisdom. The door remains open, should he ever choose to walk through it with different intentions than before. As winter gradually yielded to spring's first tentative advances, life in the farmhouse settled into patterns both old and new. The seed catalogs I had consulted each February throughout my adult life now became joint reading material for Isabella and me, our selections balancing traditional Sullivan favorites with experimental varieties related to her ongoing research. March brought Isabella's science fair presentation in Helena, where her project received not only the regional award, but special recognition from the State Agricultural Extension Office, which expressed interest in documenting her work on heirloom apple varieties for broader distribution to Montana orchardists. Your great-grandfather would be immensely proud, I told her as we drove back to the Bitterroot Valley, her ribbon and certificate carefully preserved in a folder on her lap. He believed that knowledge gained through generations of direct observation was just as valuable as formal scientific study, and that combining both approaches yielded the strongest results. Like grafting, she replied thoughtfully. Taking the strongest characteristics from different varieties to create something that preserves the best of both. Her analogy struck me as particularly apt for what had developed in our unconventional household. The grafting of Chavez family energy and adaptive resilience onto Sullivan family roots and traditions, creating something that honored heritage while ensuring future vitality. April arrived with the orchard's awakening. Buds swelling on ancient branches, early wildflowers emerging in the meadow beyond the apple trees, the first tentative birdsong returning after winter's silence. Preparing for the growing season absorbed our collective energy, with tasks distributed according to ability rather than traditional roles. Maria's steady strength managed the heavier work of early spring preparation. Isabella's youthful enthusiasm and growing technical knowledge guided decisions about new plantings and experimental grafts. My decades of experience provided context and direction, even when physical limitations prevented direct participation in more demanding tasks. Harold Jensen, our elderly neighbor who had helped maintain the orchard during my absence, continued his involvement, teaching Isabella techniques he had learned from his own grandfather, sharing childhood memories of helping my father with the harvest in the 1950s, embodying the community interconnection that had sustained the valley's agricultural traditions through changing times. Never seen an orchard pass out of family hands, and improve because of it, he observed one afternoon as we surveyed the early spring preparations. Usually the opposite. New owners without the generational knowledge let things decline or replant with whatever's commercially profitable at the moment. But this? He gestured toward Isabella carefully pruning a century-old tree under Maria's watchful guidance. This is how it should be. Knowledge passed to those who value it, regardless of bloodlines. As April advanced, we received unexpected news from Catherine Billings. Thomas has withdrawn all pending legal challenges, she informed me during our monthly update call. His attorney submitted formal notification yesterday, abandoning any claims against the property transfer or trust establishment. Did they provide any explanation? I asked, surprised by this sudden cessation of legal maneuvers that had continued at a low level since the initial hearing. Nothing official, Catherine replied. Off the record, his attorney mentioned something about reassessment of priorities following personal changes. Reading between the lines, I suspect the divorce proceedings may have prompted some reflection. I thanked her for the update, refusing to nurture false hope about what this legal retreat might signify. Thomas had likely simply calculated that continued challenges were unlikely to succeed and not worth the financial investment, particularly with the complications of divorce proceedings demanding his attention and resources. Yet a tiny seed of possibility took root despite my determination to maintain emotional equilibrium. Perhaps losing his marriage had indeed triggered some re-evaluation of what mattered. Perhaps the distance from Diane's influence had created space for different perspectives. Or perhaps it was merely pragmatic recognition of a lost cause, the characteristic cost-benefit analysis that had always governed his decision-making. Late April brought the orchard's most spectacular annual display, apple blossoms transforming, gnarled branches into clouds of delicate pink and white, their subtle fragrance permeating the air across the property. For a magical week each spring, the trees shed their utilitarian purpose and became purely aesthetic marvels, their beauty all the more poignant for its brief duration. It was during this blossoming week that the unexpected visitor arrived. I was sitting on the front porch, sketching the blooming orchard with the developing artistic ability that had emerged during my recovery, when an unfamiliar car approached on the gravel driveway, dust billowing behind its urban clean exterior. As the vehicle drew closer, I recognized neither make nor license plate, but something about the driver's silhouette triggered a mother's instinctive recognition. Thomas. Alone, without legal representatives or the buffer of Diane's presence, my son had returned to the farmhouse he had once dismissed as an underutilized asset. I remained seated, my sketchbook open on my lap, watching as he parked beside Maria's SUV and sat motionless behind the wheel for several long moments, seemingly gathering resolve. When he finally emerged, I was struck by how much he had aged in the 6 months since the courthouse confrontation. His face leaner, lines deeper around his eyes, his characteristic corporate posture somewhat diminished. He approached slowly, pausing at the bottom of the porch steps, gaze taking in the property as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last. "Hello, Mother," he said finally, his voice lacking the assertive confidence I had come to associate with his adult self. "Thomas," I acknowledged with a nod. "This is unexpected. For both of us, I think." His attempt at a smile faltered. "May I join you?" I gestured to the adjacent rocking chair, the same one Gerald had occupied during countless evening conversations throughout our marriage. Thomas climbed the steps with visible hesitation, settling carefully into the chair as if unsure of his. "Welcome." Silence stretched between us, filled with the ambient sounds of a spring afternoon in the country, birdsong, distant farm equipment, the subtle rustling of orchard blossoms in the gentle breeze. I waited, allowing him to find his way into whatever conversation he had traveled nearly 900 miles to initiate. "The orchard looks well maintained," he finally observed, "better than I remember from recent years." "Maria and Isabella have brought new energy to the place," I replied, "along with Mr. Jensen's continued help. 3 generations working together suits an orchard designed to span multiple lifetimes." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the blooming trees rather than meeting my eyes directly. "I've withdrawn the legal challenges," he said after another lengthy pause. "So I was informed. Not because they lacked merit," he added quickly, old defensiveness briefly reasserting itself, "but because I've come to recognize they were misdirected." I set my sketchbook aside, giving him my full attention. "Misdirected how?" He sighed deeply, running a hand through hair now containing more silver than I remembered. "The past 6 months have been clarifying, to say the least. The divorce, some corporate restructuring at work, health issues I hadn't anticipated." "Health issues?" I interrupted, maternal concern immediately overriding lingering hurt. "What's happened?" "Nothing life-threatening," he assured me with a dismissive wave. "Just stress-related complications. High blood pressure, insomnia, anxiety attacks. My doctor rather bluntly suggested I reassess my priorities before I ended up with problems pharmaceutical interventions couldn't address." "Sound advice," I observed neutrally, resisting the urge to lecture or commiserate. "The point is," Thomas continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about choices, consequences, values, about what Dad would think of the man I've become." He paused, swallowing visibly. "About how I treated you when you were most vulnerable." The admission hung in the spring air between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that had seemed impossible during our previous interaction. "Garden shed," I said quietly, naming the moment that had crystallized everything. He flinched slightly. "Not my finest hour," he admitted. "Diane's idea initially, but I didn't object. That's on me." We rocked silently for several minutes, the cadence of our chairs gradually synchronizing in an unconscious rhythm. The orchard, stretched before us, generations of Sullivan care embedded in each tree's formation, the blossoms representing both past cultivation and future potential. "I won't pretend I understand or agree with what you did with the property," Thomas finally continued. "From my perspective, it still seems like an emotionally driven decision rather than a rational one." "Perhaps because it was," I acknowledged. "Some decisions should be guided by values rather than financial calculations. The farmhouse isn't just real estate, Thomas. It's a living heritage." What I did ensures it remains what it has always been, a working orchard, a piece of valley history, a place where knowledge passes between generations. Even if those generations aren't Sullivan generations, he noted, though with less bitterness than before. The Sullivan legacy continues through the trust structure, the preservation of the orchard varieties your ancestors developed, the educational opportunities for local students, I explained. Maria and Isabella are stewards of that legacy, not replacements for it. Thomas turned to face me directly for the first time since his arrival. Why them? Of all the possible arrangements, why strangers? They weren't strangers to me, I corrected gently. Maria provided compassionate care during my most vulnerable time. Isabella showed genuine interest in the agricultural heritage you had rejected. They demonstrated the values I most wanted to see preserved with the property: respect for history, concern for future generations, willingness to learn traditional knowledge rather than dismissing it as obsolete. He absorbed this in silence, his expression suggesting internal struggle between habitual judgment and emerging understanding. "And where does that leave me?" he finally asked, the question revealing vulnerability I hadn't seen in him since childhood. "Outside the family history completely?" The question penetrated my careful emotional barriers, reminding me that beneath the corporate exterior and calculating approach remained my son, the boy who had once followed his father through these same orchards, who had helped press cider in the barn during autumn harvests, who had gradually drifted away from family traditions, not through single rejection, but through incremental redefinition of what constituted success and fulfillment. "You're my son, Thomas," I said simply. "Nothing changes that biological reality or shared history. The choices you've made have created distance between us, as have mine. But you remain connected to this place through memory and heritage, regardless of legal ownership." "And if I wanted to rebuild some kind of relationship?" he asked hesitantly. "Not based on property or financial considerations, but just as a family?" The question I had privately hoped for but refused to expect hung in the air between us. I measured my response carefully, unwilling to dismiss the potential olive branch, yet equally unwilling to pretend the deep wounds of betrayal could be instantly healed by one conversation. "I would welcome that," I said finally, with the understanding that trust, once broken, requires time and consistent effort to rebuild, with recognition that our fundamental values may continue to differ in significant ways, and with acceptance that my life now includes Maria and Isabella as chosen family, alongside biological connections. He nodded slowly. "That seems fair. More than fair, considering everything." Before we could continue, Isabella's voice called, from the orchard, "Mrs. Sullivan, come see this grafting technique Mr. Jensen is showing me." Thomas tensed slightly at the intrusion, perhaps realizing he would need to interact with the people he had previously dismissed as opportunistic strangers. I rose from my rocker, reaching for my cane more from habitual caution than immediate necessity. "Would you like to meet them properly?" I asked, offering an immediate opportunity to demonstrate the sincerity of his expressed desire for reconnection. No obligations or expectations, just introduction to the people who have become important in my life. He hesitated briefly before standing. "I should at least thank them for taking care of you when I failed to do so appropriately." We walked together down the porch steps and across the yard toward the orchard, my pace necessarily slowed by post-stroke caution, his unconsciously adjusting to match mine. As we approached, Isabella spotted us, her expression shifting from enthusiasm to uncertainty at the sight of an unknown visitor. "Isabella," I called, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is my son, Thomas." Her eyes widened slightly, recognition of the name and its significance evident in her expression. Behind her, Maria straightened from examining a grafted branch, her face carefully neutral as she assessed the unexpected visitor. "Thomas," I continued, "this is Isabella Chavez, whose science project documenting our heirloom apple varieties recently won regional recognition. And her mother, Maria, whose compassionate care during my rehabilitation made a critical difference in my recovery. Thomas extended his hand with formal politeness. It's good to meet you both. I understand I owe you thanks for looking after my mother when I should have been doing a better job of it myself. The acknowledgement, however limited, represented significant evolution from his previous dismissive attitude. Isabella accepted his handshake with the direct gaze of youth, unencumbered by adult calculation. Mrs. Sullivan has taught me so much about the orchard. Did you know your great-great-grandfather developed the Sullivan russet right here on this property? We're using DNA analysis to establish its genetic relationship to heritage varieties that might help with climate adaptation research. Her enthusiasm for the very agricultural heritage Thomas had dismissed as irrelevant created a moment of cognitive dissonance I could see register in his expression. The realization that what he had viewed as an outdated burden represented genuine value to someone of a younger generation and more technical background than his own. I didn't know that, actually, he admitted, though I remember Dad talking about special varieties when I was young. The documentation goes back to 1903, Isabella continued eagerly. Your great-great-grandfather kept meticulous records of cross-pollination experiments decades before modern genetic understanding. It's amazing how much they determined through observation and experimentation. As Isabella continued sharing details of her research, I observed my son's face, seeing in it the gradual softening that represents not conversion, but the beginning of perspective expansion. He would never share my emotional connection to this land or its agricultural heritage. His values would likely always prioritize innovation over tradition, financial metrics over intangible worth. But perhaps he could begin to recognize the legitimacy of different value systems, the possibility that his instinctive calculations overlooked important variables. The remainder of his visit lasted only a few hours, a tour of the property highlighting recent improvements and preservation efforts, a somewhat stilted but civil lunch on the porch, tentative conversation about his professional life and ongoing divorce proceedings. Before departing, he paused at his car, expressions suggesting words held back rather than fully expressed. This isn't how I imagined things would go, he finally said. Any of it. Not your stroke, not our conflict, certainly not the property. Transition. Life rarely follows our anticipated scripts, I replied. The question is how we adapt to the unexpected revisions. I'm trying to adapt better than I have been, he admitted. It's a work in progress. As are we all, I assured. Him, the collective wisdom of 70 years softening judgment I might once have harbored. The door remains open, Thomas, not to the past or to what might have been, but to whatever relationship we might build going forward. He nodded, a ghost of my father's thoughtful expression briefly visible in his features. I'd like to try, he said simply. Maybe a phone call next week, just to talk? I'd welcome that, I replied, refusing to inflate this modest olive branch into guaranteed reconciliation, but equally unwilling to dismiss its potential significance. After his departure, I returned to the porch rocker, retrieving my abandoned sketchbook but making no immediate move to continue drawing. Maria joined me silently, settling into the adjacent chair Thomas had recently occupied. That was unexpected, she observed after several minutes of companionable silence. Completely, I agreed. And I'm not entirely sure what it signifies. A beginning, perhaps, she suggested. Or at least, the end of active conflict. I nodded, watching the sun's late afternoon light gild the apple blossoms in the orchard beyond. Not resolution, certainly. Too much has happened for simple restoration of what was before. But perhaps something new might emerge, a relationship based on acceptance of who we actually are, rather than who we wish the other would be. That's all any of us can really offer each other, Maria noted with characteristic wisdom. acceptance of reality rather than attachment to illusion. As evening approached, Isabella joined us on the porch, homework completed and evening chores finished. The three of us sat together watching twilight settle over the Bitterroot Mountains, the orchard gradually dissolving into shadow as day yielded to night. In that moment of transition, neither full daylight nor complete darkness, I felt a profound sense of continuity despite the significant changes of the past year. The farmhouse remained what it had always been, a shelter for those who valued. Its purpose, a repository of accumulated knowledge, a bridge between generations past and those yet to come. The legal deed might bear different names than Sullivan for the first time in 5 generations, but the essential legacy continued unbroken: land, tended with respect for both heritage and future. Knowledge preserved and expanded rather than discarded as obsolete, community connections maintained across time and circumstance. 6 months earlier, I had been told to sleep in a garden shed while my bedroom was converted to a home gym. That night, I had signed away legal ownership of my family's century-old farmhouse, transferring the deed to someone who shared my values, though not my bloodline. The decision, born of necessity rather than preference, had led not to diminishment, but to unexpected expansion, of family defined by choice rather than obligation, of purpose extending beyond personal comfort, of legacy secured through unconventional means when traditional paths proved unsustainable. As stars emerged in the darkening Montana sky, Isabella pointed out constellations I had learned from my grandfather on this same porch 7 decades earlier. Knowledge flowing across generations despite changing circumstances, adaptation ensuring continuity rather than threatening it. The North Star stays fixed while everything else revolves around it, I explained, repeating words spoken to me in childhood. Sailors and travelers have relied on it for navigation throughout human history. A constant reference point in changing conditions, Maria observed thoughtfully. Exactly, I agreed, recognizing that the farmhouse had served precisely that purpose throughout my life, a fixed point of identity and belonging against which all other experiences were measured and understood. Now, through unconventional arrangements born of both betrayal and trust, that constant reference point would remain, not just for me during my remaining years, but for future generations who might otherwise never have encountered the particular wisdom embedded in this specific place, these particular trees, this unique conjunction of natural environment and human stewardship. I had been told to sleep in the garden shed, but I had handed the deed to someone else that night. In doing so, I had lost ownership but preserved legacy, a distinction my son might someday come to understand, but one I recognized with absolute clarity in that moment of twilight transition, surrounded by the chosen family who had helped transform betrayal into blessing, loss into unexpected gain. The orchard would blossom again next spring, and the spring after that, and for countless seasons beyond my lifetime. The Sullivan russet would continue fruiting, its unique genetics preserved through Isabella's meticulous documentation and continued cultivation. The knowledge accumulated through 5 generations would flow forward rather than ending with my passing. Some might view this outcome as failure, family property transferred outside bloodlines, relationships fractured by differing values, traditional inheritance patterns disrupted by necessary intervention. But sitting on the porch with Maria and Isabella as darkness settled over the land my ancestors had tended, I recognized it instead as transformation. Painful but ultimately regenerative, like the necessary pruning that strengthens rather than diminishes the orchard's future productivity. "We should go in soon," Maria suggested as the evening chill deepened. "Tomorrow we'll be busy with the grafting project." "Tomorrow," I agreed, the word encompassing not just the immediate future, but all the seasons yet to come, seasons I had ensured would unfold in accordance with the land's true purpose, rather than temporary financial considerations, and all the tomorrows beyond that. As we rose to enter the farmhouse, a home now shared rather than divided, protected rather than exploited, its legacy secured through unconventional means when traditional paths proved unsustainable, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the ending I had once anticipated, but perhaps the one the land itself had needed. New stewards grafted onto ancient roots, ensuring continued growth when direct succession had failed. I had been told to sleep in the shed, but I had handed the deed to someone else instead. And in that seemingly sacrificial act, I had gained more than I had surrendered. Not just personal dignity and autonomy, but the certainty that what mattered most would endure, not despite change, but because of it, adapting to new conditions, while remaining true to essential purpose. Like the Sullivan russet, developed through my great-grandfather's careful grafting of strength from multiple sources, the farmhouse's future now combined diverse elements into something both old and new. Heritage preserved not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful evolution, ensuring its continued relevance and vitality. The door closed. Behind us, sheltering three women from different backgrounds united by shared values and common purpose. Outside, the orchard stood in darkness, ancient trees silhouetted against the star-filled Montana sky, their blossoms promising future abundance born from generations of careful tending. Tomorrow would bring its challenges and opportunities. The legacy would continue, transformed yet intact, its essence preserved not despite change, but because of it. Living heritage passed into different but capable hands, ensuring that what truly mattered would endure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.